Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Jo Grimwood. Now this is the show where you get to pose your questions to our panel of property experts where they can really help you find those answers that you're looking for. Now I'm joined today by three esteemed gentlemen. We have Simon Zutshi, who's an author, speaker and founder of the Property Investment Network and CrowdProperty. Welcome, Simon. We're also joined by Garret O'Hanlon, who is the founding director of MAP Chartered Surveyors. Hello. Hi. And Paul Mahoney, who's the MD of Nova Financial Group. Welcome, gents. Fabulous. I'm going to start with a question for you, Paul. Now, my wife owns a property in Yorkshire, which is in negative equity. It's been on the market for well over a year now with little interest, even though it is on for significantly less than she paid for 11 years ago, on an interest-only mortgage. Now, we're planning to buy our first family house in the southeast in the not-too-distant future. But we require her salary to be part of the mortgage calculation to be able to afford what we're looking for. Can she convert her existing mortgage to a buy-to-let? And if so, are there any financial penalties? Also worth noting, she did initially live in the house when she first purchased it, but hasn't lived there for nearly 10 years.
Given it's in negative equity, you're almost a little bit trapped with regards to remortgaging. One potential solution is you could ask the current lender if they will allow her to, it's called consent to let,
right.
and let her let it out. How subsequent lenders would view that would probably be their call, because it would still be a residential mortgage, and potentially wouldn't release her from, the obligations of that residential mortgage, given that the serviceability is based upon her income. I suppose it would depend how much negative equity that property is in, but considering disposing of the property is probably something worth looking at. I know they mentioned it's on the market for less than what they paid, so perhaps that's not an option either. It's a difficult one, given that she already has the residential mortgage that ties up her income, and it's hard to sell it and hard to remortgage it given the negative equity. So I suppose, again, we're working with limited information, so certainly worth speaking with a professional to get a full picture of what all of the options are. But negative equity is always a hard one to deal with, especially when it comes to trying to get a subsequent residential mortgage and obviously your income being required for that.
Yeah. Garrett and Simon, anything to snowball onto that?
A bit worried about still being in negative equity 11 years down the line. I'm guessing she must have raised additional funds at some point and just done it at a bad time in the market. But
well, if you remember back in 2006, 2007, you could get 125% mortgages.
Yeah,
so you buy a house for 200,000, they give you 250,000. And so even with the market then crashing and recovering, there are properties around the UK still that do have negative equity.
And 11 years, perhaps she bought in 2006, 2007,
maybe just at the peak.
Was
exactly.
In a lot of regional areas. So yeah, it's a tough one, but
tough.
certainly not an enviable situation.
Yeah.
But find out what all of your options are and make the one that hurts less, I suppose.
Yes, excellent advice. Okay, so Garrett, quite a long one for you. Are you ready? Take a deep breath. Me and my partner are looking to get a mortgage. We're first-time buyers on this end terrace cottage, as we absolutely love it. However, we've just had a home buyer's survey done, roughly £500, and have had bad news. There's Japanese knotweed located 12 metres from the property in an adjacent plot. There's poorly supported roof and tiles. Progressive movement in the house, and this could be due to a very old property. External wall at the gable end in bad condition and rendered. Now, we knew this before as the gable end seemed to be slightly not straight. They valued the property at £0. Once these problems get fixed, they will value the property at the asking price of £130,000. Now, they will only do this once a structural engineer comes in to assess the property, which I believe to be the highest and most thorough evaluation there is. Should myself and my partner pay for this or the current occupants? Also, can a home buyer survey be wrong and completely exaggerated? And have they asked for a second opinion? That being of a structural engineer, that's what me and my partner are really hoping for.
58 questions in one. Okay, it doesn't sound like the dream cottage,
No.
if I'm honest with you. I'm going to try and pick a few bits and pieces out of that. Well, yeah, there is a temptation to say that. If your building society or bank value a property at £0, that's quite serious. There was a comment in there about Japanese knotweed being 12 metres away. I'm not going to drag on about Japanese knotweed, but in lender terms, 7 metres is a critical distance that will impact on its mortgageability. It is a vigorously growing plant, and it won't take long before that is 7 metres away, it's next door. How much control are you going to have over that? That's the thing to be worried about. They suggested that the property has progressive movement, but that might not be a problem because it's old. No property should ever have progressive movement, whether they're old or new. If you have that, that's a very serious problem, and that could have implications for the long term, for saleability again, for insurability. They talked in terms of getting a structural engineering, which I'm guessing is what the Bank or Building Society have suggested. And they said, is that the most thorough type of survey? Absolutely not. That is something which deals specifically with certain structural issues. In this case, it would be movement. And a structural engineer generally is not qualified to do a full building survey of the type that they've already had done. So yes, you're going to have to go with that engineer to assess that structural position. They talked about even they noticed that the gable wall was leaning outwards and had been rendered. So you start to think, was that rendered to cover up the fact that it was leaning out, but you can still see it? So that's another problem. The roof apparently was poorly framed, so that could cause a thrust, which could start to push the front and the rear walls out, as well as the side wall moving out. So you've got all of that. You've got progressive movement too. And then the question was, could the surveyor who did the home buyers report have overreacted? Well, it sounds like there's quite a lot to react to there. Hopefully not. I think sometimes people presuppose that there aren't going to be too many issues with a property, and when you go in and you find all this, that there is a feeling, oh, perhaps you're overreacting. But if all the problems are there, the problems are there. And I think unless you're a very experienced buyer, you've got to be very, very careful buying a property like that.
Absolutely. It sounds like they're really in love with it, so they're kind of almost trying to talk themselves out of the problems, but they have to weigh up whether it's going to be worth it in the long run, I think.
And there's a lot of imponderables there, because if you've got progressive movement, you might need to monitor that for a year or two. Then you might need to underpin the property. Then you restrict your potential sale market because it's been underpinned, and your insurance options are reduced as well. So really not for the faint-hearted.
No, not at all. Gentlemen, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I'd be really careful there. I mean, you have an older property, it's going to have lots of things. That sounds like it's got a lot of particular problems. Could be very expensive to fix those. You could always use those things to negotiate the price, but you know, if they're new and they're inexperienced, do they really want to take on what sounds like a bit of a money pit?
Yeah.
And you know, when you buy your own home, it's understandable emotions get involved, but you've got to be careful. When you buy an investment property, you should completely keep emotions out of it. It's all about the numbers. It's not about the nice kitchen or not, you know. But when you own a home, you get tight. So be really careful about not trying to convince themselves that this is a great deal.
Okay, great. So Simon, what are the top 5 tips for starting my own property portfolio? I've just inherited 200,000.
Okay, so I don't know how long we've got, because that's quite a big question. Try and keep it really simple. So first thing, number one, I'd say always work out, what are you looking to achieve from your investing? Are you looking to get cash flow? Are you looking to get equity growth, or some kind of combination of the two? Because the type of properties you buy and where you buy might affect the kind of returns you get. So think about why you're doing it first of all. Next thing is to educate yourself. Read books, look at magazines, go to network meetings, attend webinars, maybe do some training courses, because if you're going to be spending £200,000 on some properties, you know, that's a lot of money to spend. You want to make sure you do it right and really maximise and get the most out of that. And, you know, people make mistakes in property. It's much smarter to learn from someone else's mistakes, someone who's done there and done it, rather than make them yourself. So first of all, work out what you want. Secondly, do your education. Next thing, work out where do you want to invest. I think it's a really good idea to look close to where you live or work, because you're going to have a better understanding of what the good areas are, the not so good areas. You can keep an eye on it. However, you've got to decide, ultimately, do you want to actually do the management? I would argue that you don't really want to do that. You want to get someone else to do it. So therefore, that suggests that as long as you have the right power team around you, i.e. people who can find the properties, who can do the refurb, who can do the management, as long as you have that team in place, you could invest further afield around the country, where you might get a better return on investment. Okay, so that's something to think about. The next thing to think about is always do your due diligence. So always do your research. You want to check you're buying the right price, check there's good rental demand, check that makes money. And if someone else is sourcing a property for you elsewhere, always double check and triple check the numbers and the research. Never take anyone else's word for it. Not that they're trying to deliberately mislead you, but all sorts of people set themselves up as deal sources, and often they're new to property and they don't really know themselves. So never take anyone's word for it. And then finally, keep on checking what you're doing, keep your knowledge up to date, check in with other investors, learn from other people, make sure you're adapting, keeping on top of all the regulations, because they're changing regulations, changing financing rules, so keep your knowledge up to date. When you buy one property, you might think, I know it all now. The next property, a couple of years later, might be a different scenario. So always update your knowledge.
Fabulous. And I think to, bear into consideration, it's not just the money you're putting in, it's the time you're prepared to put in as
Absolutely,
well.
yeah.
I think that's important.
And it does take some time and effort. The time and effort you put in, it will be very well rewarded if you do it correctly. But if you buy the wrong kind of property, it might soak up loads of your time because you've got all this stress to deal with it. So be very careful. But yeah, absolutely, £200,000 is a huge amount of money to invest with. Should be able to get a really good portfolio with that.
Fabulous. Well, great answer, Simon. Thanks, gents. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with lots more fabulous questions when we return. Hello there and welcome back to Property Question Time. Today I'm joined by Simon Zutshi, Garret O'Hanlon, and also Paul Mahoney. Welcome back, gents. Okay, Simon, so we're actually going to start with a question for you. Quite a long one. Having bought a one bed in London 3 years ago with 25k deposit, I've now got 100,000 equity, maybe a tad more. I don't like the block and I'm moving out. My fiance has her own place. We're married in the spring, so we're moving in together. I can rent it, but the other income and tax clamp down means I don't make any net profit. I could sell, but I don't know where to invest the 100,000 plus equity. Any suggestions would be appreciated.
Okay, so this is often how people end up becoming property investors, is they end up with a property surplus to requirements. Maybe they inherit a property, or in this case, they met someone, they move in together, and they've got a spare property. So it's always a question, what do I do with that? And so you need to look at a couple of things. As the viewers said, that they've already looked at how much income they might come in, and they're not going to make that much money from it because of the new taxes and things. So you've got to look at the opportunity cost. They've got £100,000 tied up there. So they could sell the property, take the £100,000, reinvest it elsewhere. In fact, with that, they could split that into two deposits maybe, and buy two properties in maybe slightly cheaper parts of the country. They could get a good return on those and get obviously the capital growth on two properties, which is a good idea. What they've also got to think about is selling the first one is going to have some costs. Buying the next two is going to have costs, stamp duties, legals, etc. So sometimes, even though there's not a huge cash, and believe me, I love to get cash flow from property. It's got to make sure it must pay for itself, ideally make a profit as well. But if they feel that money is going to have really good growth there, it's had good growth the last couple of years, maybe the easiest option would be to leave it there and just let it grow. And then maybe some point in the future, another option is to maybe refinance that property and take some money out and then buy some more. So it kind of depends on the numbers. And that's really what they need to sit down and look at and understand, have they got the inclination and the knowledge to go and find more investment properties to actually buy if they then take that money out. So a couple of questions there for them to consider.
Fabulous. Whereas sitting on it for the long term, they may get some really nice capital growth, so it's worth bearing in mind as well.
If they believe that's the case, yeah, as long as it does pay for itself. They'd obviously need to change the mortgage on it to a buy-to-let mortgage because it was a residential. But assuming there's plenty of equity there, so they could well do that.
Great. Anything to add there?
Just one thing to consider. From a lender's perspective, they'd be considered an accidental landlord if they did that. So that does limit their options a little bit because they essentially didn't do it for commercial purposes. Whereas the option Simon mentioned, so far as selling and investing, intentionally, they would be considered, commercial landlords. So just something worth noting that the category they'd fit into depending on the options they chose.
I think also if they've achieved 100,000 equity from a £25,000 deposit over the last 3 years in London, keep going.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Well, having said that, the London market has grown quite a lot and started to slow. Yeah. So, I would agree. Leaving it there is definitely consideration. We've got to think about what's going to happen to the market, in the next couple of years maybe. But yeah, that's a pretty good return, right?
Yeah.
You know, I'd do that.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Okay, Garrett, question for you. Hi, we're planning to buy a late 1700 stone house in the northwest. To the massively untrained eye, it looks like it's in reasonable nick, but the seller did quite a lot of work on it around 20 years ago. And it's that rather than the age of the house that's making me nervous. After all, it's stayed up for nearly 200 years already. In my situation, what survey would you get?
Some interesting points again, that they're worried about the last 20 years and not the previous 200 years. I can understand that people are reticent that if people have done lots of work on a house, have they done it correctly? Some of that will be concealed anyway, and it depends what they've done. If they've extended and so on and so forth, then you need to check that all the regulatory requirements have been met. There is again a feeling, a cliche that old houses are better than new houses, which is completely untrue. There's good and bad across the whole spectrum. Certainly in 200 years, as I say, lots and lots of things could have happened. Broadly speaking, you should probably go for the most detailed survey, which is the building survey on something as old as that. But I think there are still people who incorrectly use the old-fashioned term of a full structural survey that hasn't been used for about 15 years now. And the reason being that you cannot have a full structural survey because you can never expose every single part of the property.
Yeah.
So inevitably, the inspecting surveyor will draw inferences from what they can see and perhaps guide you to do other things. Similarly, you'll want to see that certain treatments may have been carried out on an older property like that, where there's almost certain to be some type of wood boring infestation, but as long as it's been treated and it's under control, then that shouldn't be an issue. You're likely to have potentially listed building issues, conservation area issues might be a factor as well. But yeah, broadly speaking, you want the most detailed survey you can get. And also, and I've said it before, it's amazing how many times people come to us and say, I want you to do a survey, and we're particularly interested in A, B and C. And when you get there, A, B and C are not a problem at all, it's X, Y and Z.
Yes.
So, you know, make sure you get somebody in there who knows what they're doing, who's experienced in old buildings, experienced in surveys, and you get a decent report.
Absolutely. And obviously be prepared for ongoing work, I should imagine, if you move into an older building. Would you say that's fair?
It is fair, and the likelihood it will have quite a poor energy rating, not necessarily, but it is more likely. So, you know, the implications of heating and so forth are much greater, tend to be greater with an older property. You have completely different standards of what you will accept in terms of movement, unevenness and things like that. And you need an experienced eye there to make those judgments for you.
Yeah, my friend had a beautiful older property, but unfortunately they weren't able to change the windows, so they were freezing in the winter.
Exactly.
They could hear every single noise, so they ended up having to sell at a loss because there was nothing they could do about it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, your listing authorities again are quite strict about what you can and can't do, not just inside and outside, sorry, but inside as well. So be fully aware of what you're getting into. It's more complicated with an older property like that.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you. And Paul. Buy to let, is it worth it? As it stands, I turn 29 next month and I have 32k left on my mortgage. My salary is about 29k a year. I've had my house for 3 years next month and have overpaid on it since I've had it, using my 10% overpayment allowance each year. I have about 12k in stocks and shares, ISA, and a mutual fund which I want to keep going. Instead of overpaying, am I better using that money and saving for another deposit, or getting a buy to let?
Okay, a couple of parts to that question. First part, so far as is buy-to-let worth it? I'd say absolutely, in the right circumstances. There's been lots of changes recently. You need to understand those changes and how they affect certain properties and generally certain areas, and whether things still stack up. But yes, absolutely, in the right circumstance, it still works if you're ticking all the boxes. And therefore is something worth very seriously considering to help you build an investable asset base. So far as whether that person should keep paying down their home loan or save to invest in property, the two aren't mutually exclusive. And in fact, I'd say often you're better off paying down your home loan to save to invest in property, because by paying down your home loan, you will generally be getting a better interest rate than putting the cash in the bank. And then you can remortgage your home to take that cash back out and invest. So, yeah, again, not necessarily specific to that person, but that can be a good option to look more closely at. When it comes to making sure that buy-to-let stacks up for them specifically, they'll need to understand their goals, what it is they're hoping to achieve from investing in property, again, seek advice to better understand that, because certainly something that I think is quite common is the things that you think you might want aren't really the things you want once you dig into it a bit deeper. And then put in place a strategy. Make sure, as I say, you're ticking all the boxes. You understand all the recent changes in the market. Buy-to-let isn't a DIY activity anymore. It's generally one of the largest purchases you'll ever make. So solely for that reason, you shouldn't be doing it on your own unless you know exactly what you're doing. But with all the changes recently, it's a lot more complicated. So a good decision is very different to a bad decision, and you need to make sure you're making a good one.
Yeah, research, of course, and just looking into all the options is very important when looking at investing in property. And just, again, being prepared to put a lot of time and energy into that at the same time.
And, self-education is great, and I absolutely recommend that people educate themselves. But as individuals, we're all limited by resources. We can only achieve so much on our own, regardless of our experience or knowledge. Yeah. So, utilising the resources of somebody or a company that can help you with that is quite useful in most cases.
Can I just say also, I think there's a tendency you go to your financial advisor or your broker, obviously, to discuss all of that aspect that we just covered. And people often will think they'll go to the surveyor to talk about the technical elements of the building, but there are places where it wouldn't be wise perhaps to be investing for other reasons. And very often your surveyor is the chap that knows those areas and can give you advice not just about the building, but about that too. So, it's tangential, but it's very relevant at times.
Brilliant. Anything to add, Simon?
Just to back those guys up, don't try and do it on your own. Get a good power team around you. And I would always suggest that the people you get advice from, you need to make sure that they are actually investing in property themselves. There are lots of financial advisors who don't really understand property. And that's because historically they haven't got commission for selling properties. They get commission for selling insurance and pensions and stock investments. So try and find people who are investing themselves, and that includes your mortgage broker and ideally includes your solicitor as well. And they'll have a much better understanding of what you're trying to achieve.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much to our panel of experts, Simon, Garrett and Paul. That's all we've got time for here today at Property Question Time. You can get involved by posing a question to our panel of experts, and you can do that by just sending it into the following email address, which is info@property-tv.co.uk, or logging that question on our website. We look forward to seeing you next time here at Property Question Time.